When you look around the USA these days, the sheer diversity of faces and cultures, it feels like something really significant is happening, maybe a real turning point in our national story.
Absolutely. It makes you wonder about the deeper currents, doesn't it? And that's kind of what we're diving into today. We've got some really interesting pieces that shine a light on different aspects of this.
Exactly. So we'll be digging into an article called Immigrants in the USA, a missional opportunity that gives us a look at the numbers and, some of the faith-based stuff here.
Right.
Then we're kind of heading north to Canada with a new paradigm of the parish. It's about the
Yeah.
missionary oblates and Polish immigrants there. Really fascinating case study, actually.
Yeah, how one group sort of shaped their religious environment.
hmm And then to broaden things out even more, we've got identity and ecumenical partnership of churches of African origin in Germany. So looking at African immigrant churches in, a European context.
Okay, so the goal here really is to dig into these sources, understand the core issues, the challenges, and importantly, the opportunities that come with immigration, going beyond just the headlines.
Definitely. Let's start here in the U.S. The first article lays out some pretty, striking numbers. Back in 2010, we're talking almost 40 million immigrants.
Wow. Out of what, 300 something million total?
Yeah, about 309 million. So that's like roughly 13%. And what jumped out at me was that over 17 million of those were already naturalized citizens. So really integrated.
That is a huge chunk of the population. And then just in 2011, over 1 million people got legal permanent resident status.
A million in 1 year.
Yeah, and nearly half were new arrivals. But here's an interesting point the article makes. While the U.S. gets the most immigrants in just sheer numbers, the percentage of our population that's foreign-born isn't actually the highest.
Oh, really? Where do we rank?
It says 26th out of 159 countries with over 1 million people. So other places have a higher proportion, even if the total number is smaller.
Huh. That's a good distinction. It kind of reframes it, doesn't it? But the kind of immigration we're seeing now is also changing big time, according to the source.
How so?
Well, it's moving beyond those, let's say, traditional streams from Europe, Latin America, Asia. Now we're seeing large communities from non-traditional backgrounds, like Detroit has a big Iraqi population, Minneapolis has Somalis.
Right, and it mentions a church in Times Square with like over 100 nationalities represented. Just imagine that.
Crazy. And this isn't just happening in the usual gateway cities, New York, L.A.
No, the article makes a point that it's hitting more unexpected places too, like rural areas in Virginia, Georgia, even Illinois.
Yeah, Beardstown, Illinois. It jumped from under 1% foreign-born to over 17% in, less than 2 decades. That really shows how widespread it is.
Definitely pushes back against the idea that this is just a big city thing. So what's driving people to these maybe less obvious places? Jobs.
Yeah, you'd have to assume job opportunities, specific labor needs, maybe. But here's where it gets really, really interesting. July 2011.
Okay, what happened then?
That was apparently the tipping point. For the first time, minority births in the U.S. outnumbered white births.
Wow. That feels like a truly profound moment, signaling this big shift towards a much more globalized, multi-ethnic country.
Exactly. So why are people coming? The article touches on the main reasons, as you'd expect. Work, family. Those are huge.
Right. Standard drivers.
But also, study is a big one. Over 723,000 international students in just the 2010-11 academic year.
That's a lot of students.
And then importantly, you've got the humanitarian side. Refugees seeking safety, over 56,000 admitted in 2011. And sadly, the article also mentions human trafficking, estimating about 17,500 people trafficked into the U.S. each year.
Right. So a whole mix of motivations, which probably means really different experiences for people once they get here.
Definitely. Now, the article pivots a bit here to look at how faith communities are responding, specifically white evangelicals. And there's a 2006 Pew study mentioned.
Okay, what did it find?
Well, it found that white evangelicals, around 63% of them, were actually more likely than secular groups to see immigrants as a threat to American customs and values.
63%. That's quite high compared to secular groups. Why do you think that perception exists within that group specifically?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The article points out something crucial. 88% of those same white evangelicals said their views on immigration were shaped more by non-religious concerns.
Okay. So a disconnect, maybe, between, say, biblical teachings about welcoming the stranger and these other concerns.
Seems like it. It makes you wonder what those non-religious concerns actually are, and how they might be sort of overriding the faith aspect.
And this, according to the author, leads to a missed, what does he call it? An enormous missional opportunity.
Right. The argument is maybe this movement of people isn't just random. Maybe it's part of like a bigger divine plan.
Yeah.
It references Acts 17.27, the idea that the mission field is basically landing on our doorstep.
That completely reframes it, doesn't it? From seeing immigrants as maybe a problem or a threat to seeing them as, well, people God might be bringing here for a reason, people to connect with.
Yeah, and there's a quote from a guy named Bill Nelson, something about maybe needing to prioritize the kingdom flag over the American flag to really reach immigrants. That's pretty provocative.
It really cuts to the core of it, that potential tension. But the article also points out a big practical hurdle: church segregation.
Oh, yeah. The stat is pretty stark, isn't it? Something like 92.5% of evangelical churches are largely segregated.
That's incredibly high. It makes it physically difficult to even meet, let alone build relationships with, people from different backgrounds if everyone's in separate spaces on Sunday morning.
Exactly. And they tie this back to Hebrews 13.2, show hospitality to strangers, because you might be entertaining angels without knowing it. It really puts the onus on how our actions, our attitudes, impact how immigrants experience things.
So to maybe help shift those attitudes, the article goes into the biblical background. It starts with the Old Testament idea of the deserter, the stranger, the sojourner.
Right, and how they were seen as vulnerable alongside widows and orphans needing community support.
And it lists several scriptures showing God's specific care for the deserter: Deuteronomy, Psalms, Zechariah. It's a consistent theme. And this divine care sets the example for how God's followers should act, right through to the New Testament, like in Matthew 25.
It really hammers home how deeply rooted this idea of caring for the immigrant is. And it reminds us that migration itself is all through the Bible, isn't it?
Yeah.
Abraham, Ruth, Joseph, even Jesus as a refugee in Egypt.
Totally. It's not a new thing. But what is kind of unique now, the article argues, is how accessible this mission field is right here, domestically, through these diaspora communities.
Right, people living outside their home countries but often maintaining strong connections. This has huge implications for religion in the U.S.
Yeah, get this. The U.S. is the top destination for Christian migrants. They make up almost 3/4 of the entire foreign-born population here.
74%. That's massive.
It is, but it's also a top spot for Buddhist migrants, those with no religion, and second for Hindu and Jewish migrants. So real religious diversity coming in.
And if you look at where people are coming from, the Philippines, India, China, Germany are mentioned, you see the missional side again, especially from places where maybe traditional mission work is difficult.
Like China, Saudi Arabia, Iran. The article suggests immigrants from these places might find new freedoms here to explore Christianity.
It also touches on Muslim migrants, noting the U.S. is the 7th biggest destination for them, and includes a warning from Pastor Daniel Darling about not letting fear paralyze outreach efforts.
Yeah, basically saying we need to extend compassion to everyone.
And importantly, it's not just about reaching out to immigrants. The Christian immigrants themselves are often really dynamic agents of mission. Their churches are growing fast.
Absolutely. They're bringing new life, new perspectives. We're seeing denominations like the Southern Baptists and the Foursquare Church becoming much more diverse because of this.
It really drives home that idea of the global church being present right here. The article uses that 1 Corinthians 12 analogy, the body having many different parts, all needed.
It's a powerful image for the richness diversity brings, which leads naturally to this idea of missions to and through diasporas.
Right. We hear about churches like Willow Creek and Vineyard Columbus that are really intentional about welcoming immigrants. They have ESL classes, care centers, refugee resettlement help, hospitality for students.
And they're seeing growth because of it. There's that quote from Bill Christensen at Vineyard Columbus.
Oh, yeah, the one about how immigrant growth changed their church forever,
Yeah.
making it a fuller expression of the kingdom of God.
That's the one. It really speaks to the transformative power of embracing this diversity.
Yeah. Despite stories like that, the article drops another confounding stat. Only about 10% of evangelical churches actually have specific ministries focused on immigrants.
Only 10%. Wow. Given the numbers we just talked about, that feels like a huge gap. What do you think stops more churches? Lack of awareness, resources, fear, maybe?
Could be all of the above. Maybe just uncertainty about how to even start, But the flip side is how these diaspora communities themselves are doing evangelism.
Right, reaching their own people. The article mentioned Latino Protestants, for instance, and the story of New Life Covenant Church in Chicago.
Yeah, amazing growth driven by those strong family and community networks.
And that story about the Bhutanese refugees is incredible. They encounter Christianity in refugee camps, come to the U.S., and immediately start planting their own churches, baptizing people, needing discipleship.
Yeah, and it mentions other groups too, like Burmese and Iraqi refugees bringing this really strong faith and evangelistic drive.
The Chin Baptist Churches USA is another example of these growing ethnic church networks. It shows they're not just passive recipients, they're active missionaries.
And the mission flow is changing directions too, isn't it? The U.S. is becoming a mission field for people from the global south.
Exactly. Which means, the article argues, we need a shift. We need to see immigrant pastors and leaders as equal partners, not just people to be ministered to, recognize their experience.
That partnership idea feels key. The article also mentions theological schools equipping leaders and lists practical things churches can do. Build relationships, equip people, help different groups partner up, provide resources.
So, wrapping up the U.S. part, the source sees four main impacts: demographic diversification, the transformation of American Christianity itself, the openness many non-Christian immigrants have to the gospel here, and, well, the adjustments American Christians need to make.
Yeah, and it ends on a hopeful note, right? About honoring our immigrant heritage and building that diverse worshiping community from Revelation 7.9.
Okay, so let's shift gears now. We're heading north to Canada to look at the Polish immigrant experience through that second article. This gives us more of a historical view, starting way back in the late 19th century.
What stood out to me right away was this idea of Polish parishes, how they were different from, say, Polish missions back in Europe.
Right. In Canada, these parishes were set up firmly under the local Canadian bishop's authority, not some dual authority structure.
And the context is important, isn't it? Canada encouraging immigration from Central Europe back then, needing labor for the Western farms.
Yeah, so lots of people came, including many Poles. And just like we see elsewhere, the government maybe wasn't fully ready for their specific cultural and religious needs. There was some apprehension, maybe some misunderstanding.
Understandable, I guess. But these immigrants, despite the challenges of finding work and settling in, found some key allies, didn't they?
They did, particularly the missionary oblates of Mary Immaculate, the OMI. They were already active on the prairies, especially advocating for French speakers to keep their language and faith.
So they already had this framework of supporting immigrant groups, and that kind of extended to the Poles and others.
Seems like it. The huge demographic changes happening out west meant new church structures were desperately needed. Central European Catholics often struggled to fit into existing local parishes because of language or different customs.
And Archbishop Langevin in St. Boniface was crucial here.
Absolutely. He saw the need for pastors who could connect. He found two Polish brothers, the Kulawi brothers, studying at the Oblate Seminary. They spoke Polish, German, French, English, even some Ukrainian, Czech, Slovak. Perfect fit.
Wow, talk about multitasking.
Yeah.
So the Holy Ghost Parish in Winnipeg becomes the big example.
Right. Initially, Langevin had this idea for a more cosmopolitan parish serving different groups together, hence the multilingual name.
But that didn't quite work out smoothly.
No, as often happens, tensions popped up, mostly between the Polish and German communities, the two biggest Catholic groups there at the time. Separate masses in different languages didn't even solve it.
So the Germans eventually formed their own parish, and the Ukrainians had their own Eastern Rite traditions anyway.
Exactly. It's interesting the article contrasts this with the U.S., where similar tensions among Polish immigrants actually led to a breakaway group, the Polish National Catholic Church.
But that didn't happen in Canada. Why not? What did Langevin and the Oblates do differently?
Well, it seems like they were just more proactive, more understanding, willing to respect the distinct needs of the Polish community, giving them pastors who spoke their language. That probably built a stronger sense of belonging within the main Catholic Church.
Made them feel seen and heard, maybe?
Oh.
And the first pastors, they were young oblates, right? Not much experience, but lots of energy.
Yeah, basically thrown into the deep end, building communities from scratch. Later, a second Polish parish, St. John Cantius, was also set up in Winnipeg.
But the really cool part is how these parishes became more than just churches. They became like small Polands.
Exactly. Centers for everything. They set up their own schools, a Polish newspaper, the Gazeta Katolika, which the Oblates supported.
And all sorts of social groups, too. Mutual aid societies, choirs, religious groups, youth clubs, even secular groups connected in.
Yeah, it was a whole ecosystem designed to support the community and preserve their culture and faith.
And this model, it wasn't just Winnipeg, right? It spread.
Oh, yeah. Edmonton, Vancouver out west, then later Toronto, Ottawa, St. Catharines in the east. Places like St. Stanislaus Kostka and St. Casimir in Toronto became major hubs.
They even had joint projects like that Catholic Youth Radio show in Toronto.
So the article wraps this part up by saying, yeah, there were difficulties managing these ethnic parishes in a multicultural country, but they also opened up new pastoral possibilities.
But it asks if the model will last, right? With younger generations assimilating, marrying outside the community.
Exactly. It's a real question. But ultimately, it frames this whole development as a key example of enculturation, the faith adapting and expressing itself within a specific cultural context, right down to the church structure. And the Catholic Church itself recognized this approach in official documents.
Okay, interesting. So one final stop, Germany. Looking at churches of African origin, or CAOs, there was a big jump in African immigration there starting in the 70s.
A huge jump. The African population grew more than tenfold in about 30 years, hitting over 300,000 by the late 90s, and that might even be an undercount.
Wow. And with that growth came more community organization.
Naturally, people started forming cultural groups, support networks, and, crucially, organizing their own religious life. It's a diverse religious scene, but mostly Christian. And tons of African-led congregations started popping up in cities like Berlin, Frankfurt, Hamburg.
And these congregations, they see themselves as mainly by and for Africans, but still open to working with others.
Yeah, open to ecumenical ties, international connections. And there's this interesting observation from Harold Turner made a while back about African churches seeing themselves as having a mission to Europe.
Why? What was the thinking?
Well, the perspective seemed to be that maybe European churches were a bit static, lacking some spiritual dynamism compared to what was happening in Africa.
Maybe differences in worship style. Or just the sheer growth of Christianity in Africa compared to Europe.
Could be. And you see this outward global focus in their names, right? Lots of them use words like international, global, worldwide.
Like the Church of the Lord, Eladura, worldwide example, explicitly aiming to bring Christianity everywhere, including the industrialized world.
Exactly. The article lists several of these African-initiated churches, AICs, that are well established in Germany and Europe, planting daughter churches. It also clarifies the name preferring African-initiated over independent or indigenous.
Why is that name important?
Initiated really emphasizes their agency, that they grew from African communities, not just Western missions. And some even use African international churches to highlight that global scope.
Okay. Then the article gives us a framework for how these churches develop in Germany. 3 phases: seclusion, opening, and interculturation.
Right, and it stresses these aren't necessarily rigid steps. Churches can move between them.
So seclusion is like the early stage, using mother tongues, focusing inward, not many outside connections.
Pretty much. Then the opening phase sees more use of, say, German in services, reaching out more broadly to all Christians, starting some ecumenical contacts.
And interculturation is the deepest integration. More German language, German members joining and influencing things, joint mission work, tackling everyday issues together.
Exactly. And interculturation highlights that it's a two-way street, mutual exchange.
Okay. And finally, how do these CAOs partner with established German churches? There are different models.
Yeah, 3 main ones. The parallel model is basically just renting space, not much real contact.
Like ships passing in the night.
Kinda. Then the sister church model is closer, more exchange, maybe shared services, leaders visiting each other, joint youth stuff, helps break down barriers.
And the last one, integration.
That's where MLEAD members might actually join German Pentecostal churches. There's also a submodel mentioned, the Mitenend Church in Basel, trying to intentionally bring diverse people together in one congregation. But that requires the established church to adapt too, maybe even financially.
Right. So the article ends by saying these CAOs can be important bridges in wider ecumenism, especially once they move into those opening or interculturation phases.
But it only really works if both sides participate, right?
Yeah.
The CAOs and the German churches have to be willing to learn from each other for real transformation to happen.
Okay. So wrapping this all up, we've covered a ton of ground. We saw the massive demographic shifts in the U.S., the missional opportunities and challenges that brings.
Both reaching immigrants and seeing them as missionaries.
Right. Then the historical example from Canada showing how ethnic parishes met specific needs for Polish immigrants.
Yeah, that whole small Poland concept and enculturation.
And finally, Germany, looking at how African churches are finding their identity and building partnerships in a new land.
By looking at all these different angles, U.S., Canada, Germany, present day, historical terror, we hopefully get a much richer, more, well, nuanced picture of immigration than just the usual sound bites.
Absolutely. Which kind of leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener. Thinking about these stories, these different experiences, how might understanding them better change how we view cultural and religious diversity right here in our own communities?
Or maybe what could be the long-term impacts, socially and spiritually, of these big demographic and religious shifts happening in places like the US and Germany? Lots to chew on.
Definitely. We hope you'll take some time to reflect on these diverse experiences and maybe even explore what's happening in your own local area a bit more.